Hello, everyone. This is Kerwin and Keith of Father Son Galaxy. As the 25th anniversary of Star Wars: The Phantom Menace approaches, Lucasfilm and Marvel Comics has released a series based on one of the more popular characters from the prequel trilogy. Star Wars Mace Windu, issue number 1, released in February, is written by our guest. Marc Bernardin is a WGA Award-winning television writer-producer who has worked on Star Trek Picard, Carnival Row, Treadstone, Castle Rock, Critical Role, The Legend of Vox Machina, Masters of the Universe, Revelations, and Alphas. In 2023, he made his directorial debut with an award-winning short film, Splinter. In comics, he's the Eisner-nominated writer of Messenger, The Legend of Muhammad Ali, Adora in the Distance, Census, Peter Parker, The Amazing Shutterbug, Genius, and The Highwaymen. Marc's career began as a journalist. He was a writer-editor for the Los Angeles Times, The Hollywood Reporter, and Entertainment Weekly. Marc is the co-host of the pop culture podcast, Fat Man Beyond, with filmmaker Kevin Smith. Marc Bernardin, welcome to Father Son Galaxy.
Thank you. That is very kind of you to both invite me on and say such wonderful things that I may or may not have told you to say.
No, this. You have a longer list of accomplishments, so we had to shorten it for this introduction. So, thank you.
Okay, so congratulations on the Mace Windu series. First of all, we have the first issue right here. So after you watched the prequel trilogy, what was your impression of Mace Windu and Samuel L. Jackson's performance?
Listen, Keith, I'm here all day for Sam Jackson. I have been a fan of Sam Jackson since he tried to throw down on a McDowell's in Queens, New York. And coming to America, I followed him, through being unceremoniously murdered in Goodfellas. I followed him to Holding On to Your Butts in Jurassic Park. But I always appreciated him in Star Wars. And I think that for a certain kind of audience, namely, let's call it the Black audience, we only ever really get one Black person to care about at a time in a Star War. For a while, it was Billy D. Williams was our way in, and then you come to Mace Windu, then you come to, the baddest dude in the entire galaxy, and purple lightsabers are always cool. As a longtime fan of Prince, I've become a fan of everything purple, and so just watching him kind of hold his own, watching him claim his space, watching him sort of defend his ground as not just a Jedi, not just one of the most powerful Jedi, but the right hand of Yoda, was a really big deal, in the prequel trilogies. And to watch the way he is allegedly killed in Revenge of the Sith, because I don't believe he's dead. I was like, you know what? I think there's probably more to this guy. There's more history. And I come to the Star Wars franchise as a lover of the movies, first and foremost. I've skittered on the top of the extended universe stuff. Like I read a novel or two over time. I played a lot of video games, and I dabbled in the comic books. But that is my love for it comes from the movies, and so it always felt that there was more story to tell. And I knew people had dug into Mace Windu's history and his background, but I still thought there was miles on that road that we could still go down.
So you described the Windu series as a cross between a James Bond film and the movie Midnight Run. Could you go a little more in depth?
Midnight Run, if you've never seen it, is one of the great 80s. I'd call it a buddy cop movie, except it's not a buddy cop movie because neither people are cops. But it's a road movie about a bounty hunter and his target, his quarry, who have to make it from point A to point B unscathed, and they have to survive it. And the banter between them was always so much fun. The tricky situations they got into and out of were always a riot, but it just had this sense of energy, this sense of we're having a good time here, that I kind of wanted to bring to this miniseries. And the James Bond of it is, if you read that first issue, it is very much structured like a James Bond adventure, where we see the tail end of the previous adventure with not a ton of context for what it is or what it means, but it just looks like it's fun and it's interesting, and there's a location we've never been to before. It's a problem that your hero is going to solve. He then returns back to base, and he meets with his handler. And James Bond, it would be M. In this, it's Yoda, who gives him the next mission. He goes and talks to Q Branch to explain to him the tools that he has on it. And I always like that sort of setup as a jumping off point for adventure. I mean, they would also steal it in Raiders of the Lost Ark, which Spielberg famously wanted to make a James Bond movie and discovered, they only let Brits make a James Bond movie, so I'm going to do my own thing. And that movie also begins with him on a previous adventure that may or may not have anything to do with what goes forward. It brings him back to his home base, his university. Army guys show up and send him on a new mission. It's that feeling of you're always in motion with this guy. There's an adventure that comes before and an adventure that's going to come after, but this is the 2 hours you're going to spend with your hero. And so I like burning those two things together and welding them into one piece.
Yeah. I'm a big James Bond fan, so I picked up on the similarities. The movie that came to mind for me was Casino Royale. And that was, well, if you haven't seen it, that is James Bond, a very young James Bond, getting his 00 license.
There's a license for that?
Well, yeah. So
you got to get like a piece of paper to put 2 zeros before the number.
Well, it's a license. Oh, you're just joking. All right.
Get it? Check it out. Like the movie.
Thanks for interrupting me.
I mean, there's a driving test. There's a vision test. There's all of that.
Yeah, that's
I'm sure. I'm hoping that job comes with dental from the amount of jumping these people.
Oh yeah, health insurance is probably right.
They better have good health benefits.
Yeah.
Top notch.
You gotta have that. Yeah. So Casino Royale. So this is when James Bond starts off at the beginning. He just got his 007 license. The next mission that he takes on doesn't go as planned, and there's a scene where Bond breaks into his boss's M's apartment. Bond is played by Daniel Craig.
Yes.
His boss M is played by Judi Dench, and he is in her apartment, and she walks in, and she is livid, and she, tears into him about the mistakes that he made on this trip, on this mission. And one of the things that she said to him, what I thought was very interesting, was that I knew it was too early to promote you, and that she referred to him as a blunt instrument. And you have a similar line like that from Yoda. Yoda, as if you were thinking of Yoda as the M character. Mace Windu walks in to the Jedi Temple, and Yoda's not looking at Mace. Mace is standing behind him, and Yoda says, "Nearby my towel is, wet behind the ears you still are." Yeah, it was just that one liner that just reminded me of something that M would say to Bond. Like, was there a particular film, James Bond film, that came to mind? Was it Casino Royale, or was it something else?
It was a mixture of Casino Royale, because I do like that as an early adventure in James Bond's life. And I also a little bit of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which I think is an excellent James Bond movie marred by an awful James Bond. And From Russia with Love, which is, a grittier version of it. Not quite as gritty as Casino Royale, but of the sort of 60s, 70s versions. Like, I feel like From Russia with Love doesn't quite get the love that it should, because it is a really strong movie. My favorite bit of expanded universe kind of headcanon that I have about Casino Royale is just that scene where he breaks into M's bedroom, and the first thing he says to her was, I thought M was just a code name. I didn't realize that your name was, and she cuts him off. And the idea that M, as played by Judi Dench, her first name is Margaret, and she is actually also Peggy Carter, because Peggy is short for Margaret. So the idea that she grew up and eventually would head up MI6 and the 00 section, I was like, oh, that's just beautiful. I love it in my head. And that is what it always will be from now on for me.
Could you imagine that?
It's great.
It's a little cool bit of lore.
It just welds together all the things that I love.
So Mace Windu and James Bond are two very different characters, but they have similarities. Both take their jobs very seriously, and they carry deadly weapons. But the one thing Bond has that Mace Windu doesn't is his wit. Bond is the king of one-liners, just like Tony Stark and Spider-Man, but Windu in the films and the Clone Wars is never cracking jokes or smiling, and he's always serious. Is Windu the same character in your series, or did you develop another side of Mace Windu that we haven't seen on screen before?
I feel like this Mace is a little bit funnier. I mean, he's not a comedian, like he is not the punster, the one crack, the wisecrack guy. But I grew up, loving 80s movies, and all of those 80s movies had this little, like, it was always winking at you at the same time that ridiculous heroes were doing ridiculous things. And so I came to it with this as a younger Mace. This is a Mace Windu who has, I don't know how recently he sheared off his Padawan lock. I don't know at what point we are in regard to his baldness, but it was definitely early in his career. And there would be a thing that happened to him later that made him so serious, but he's not there yet. And so there's a little bit of levity to this guy. There's a little bit of lightness to it. He's still always the man on the mission. He's still always, committed to the task. But there's a joke or two that he'll tell. There's a crack or two that he'll wise.
Could you tell us some more about the new characters, Gara and Zeta Cruz?
Gara was our sort of Q replacement. She's the person who ultimately gives him the mission, and I liked there being, so much of the time, at least in my head, I think of the Jedi Temple. I think of like Jedi's practicing stuff, and I think of spiritual awakenings, and I think of contemplative meditations. And it's like, this is also kind of a paramilitary organization. There's still people who are planning stuff. There's still people, keeping their eyes on the galaxy and making sure that there are hot spots that need attending to. And so I love that there was a spy master who kind of lived and worked within the Jedi Temple. That wasn't Yoda. Yoda's not that guy. Yoda occupies a whole nother sort of layer and level in the Jedi Order, but there would 100% be somebody who would send people out on operations and who would give them the information they needed. And so I like creating that character. And also the thing about doing a story like Mace Windu, of dealing with a character who is not mine and I cannot change, is that the joy comes in giving him people to respond to who can say things he wouldn't say. And that was the impetus behind the Zeta Cruz character. We have to put him next to somebody who can have perspectives about this world that Mace doesn't share. She has not drank the Kool-Aid of the Jedi Order. She has questions about it that he either had and answered or never rose to the top of his mind. And so when you need somebody for him to clash against, to have a difference of opinion against, you need conflict. Without conflict, there is no drama. And so at some point, she will agree with him and understand him, and they will get to a place of resolution and understanding. But while it's just the two of them, they needed to have things they could disagree about. And so Azita, as a character who likes being alone, as a character who doesn't believe in much of anything, is confronted with this guy who is all about belief and is all about understanding and all about, the Jedi Order and the great things that it does for the galaxy. And so being able to pair those two characters together and run them against each other, for me was really necessary.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little more about what Mace's mission is without giving away too much spoilers?
Without giving away too much of what happens in subsequent issues, he is detached to go to the refinery moon of Romira to negotiate for a formula for coaxium ultra, which coaxium, if you're not familiar, is basically the go-go juice of the Star Wars universe. It makes the ships go. It makes hyperdrive possible. Somebody's created a refined version of it. Basically, it's space NOS, if this was Fast and the Furious. And the last thing the Jedi Order wants is sort of pirates and smugglers and ne'er-do-wells to be faster than they are in the open skies. It'll be hard to police a galaxy where the bad guys can run away from you all the time. And so that's his quest, is to find this formula, make sure that the Jedi are the ones who control it, and to buy every last drop of it that's ever been mined and refined. Azita Cruz happens to be the person who has the formula and the sort of stocks, what stocks there are of it. And so she's going to sell to the highest bidder, and Mace needs to make sure that that's him.
Now, this is an earlier story. This goes back even before the Clone Wars. But I want to go back to something that you said about Mace Windu is not dead. So that's what you believe. I know there's some people in the fandom who believe the same thing, but you as a writer, if you were to create a story to bring back Mace Windu, how would you do that?
I think science fiction is the one of the great gifts of science fiction is it's all about metaphor. It's all about telling, contemporary stories in a sort of far off setting that allows the medicine to go down easier. But B, nobody ever dies in science fiction unless you literally see a body. And even then, it might not even matter. And so the idea that all we saw of Mace Windu was his body just kind of fling off into the Coruscant night. It's like, I never saw no body. Also, all it was lightning, and it's Mace Windu. Like, I 100% believe that dude survived that fall, that shock, that trauma, whatever it was. And given that it was the night of Order 66, like, maybe he's been in as much hiding as everybody else has been. And so, I don't know. I feel like there's a story that picks up those threads and reintroduces Mace Windu into whatever version of the world we want it to be, whether it's, the sequel trilogy, whether it's somewhere in between, whether it's his own story that dovetails with Rogue One, whatever version that is. There's more story there, and Sam Jackson is not too old to do it. In fact, he's probably just the right age.
It would be nice to see a present day series of Mace Windu just picking up the pieces and coming back to the Resistance or the Rebellion or whatever's around at that time.
Yeah, no, 100%. Here and also I feel like every Jedi story is ultimately a story about faith. And what happens when your faith is shattered? What happens when it is not rewarded? And so the idea that Mace has been broken by that experience, and his faith in the Senate, his faith in the Republic, his faith in society, his faith in the Jedi, all of it is tested and has been found wanting. So now who is that guy on the other side of that? What does he want? And what is he willing to do to get it?
Well, I want to go back to your early years. I have a magazine right here that you might be familiar with. So this...
Oh, sweet Starlog.
Yeah. So this is I'm holding a copy, of course, if people are not watching, I'm holding a copy of a 1983 issue of Starlog Magazine. So for those who don't know Starlog or not familiar with the magazine, can you tell us what this magazine is about? What did you do when you were there, and why Starlog was so important to the sci-fi and fantasy community back in the day?
Starlog Magazine was the nerd internet before the internet existed. Because back in the olden days, the days of yore, the only way for science fiction fans to get any information on any of the stuff that they loved were magazines like Starlog and Cinefantastique and Fangoria, the sister publication, and Famous Monsters of Filmland, and because nobody was writing about it, nobody was covering it, no magazines were really about that life unless it was Batman. Like, Batman in 1989 made Time magazine, but you were not getting information about, Krull from Time magazine. You were not getting information about RoboCop from your average publication, from an average newspaper. And because there was no internet, magazines like Starlog is what did that for you. It was all interviews and no reviews. It was never a critical thing. It was more, here's just data of the stuff you love. Here's pictures, here's behind the scenes, here's interviews with filmmakers and actors and craftsmen. They were very big on talking to the people who actually made the stuff. And so I worked there. I was an intern in my senior year of college, and then they offered me a full-time job in 1993. And I was there from 93 to 96. And I started as a very young editor. I learned how to do journalism at Starlog. And also was guess I was a consulting editor on Fangoria at the same time, because there was only 6 editors in that entire building making like a dozen magazines. Fango and Starlog and Comic Scene, and they all did a bunch of licensed magazines for movies you may or may not have ever heard of or probably forgotten. And it was wonderful. You know, I mean, I got to talk to writers and publicists, and because it was, again, pre-internet, I got my first email address working for Starlog. And so just being exposed to kind of the history of science fiction in a very concentrated way from people who loved it. It was a magazine that was just founded on love for genre. Was really, really instrumental for me, both as a journalist and as a writer, but also as a nerd, you know, to be like, oh, I'm not the only person who loves it and who treats it this seriously.
Yeah, it was the right magazine at the right time. Of course, I grew up in that era of Starlog and Fangoria. There was Cinefex. There were so many magazines. It wasn't just comic books. When you walk into the shop, it's not just comic books. It's the magazine section that I, most of the time go to get my news and information. So that's pretty cool. What I didn't know was Starlog was around for 33 years.
And yeah, they launched, I want to say it was like 75, 76, mostly to cater to a Star Trek fandom, that the conventions were beginning to happen post cancellation of Star Trek. And so early mid 70s, when like Creation, I think was the company that was doing it, was doing these Star Trek cons around the country, and Kerry O'Quinn, and I can't remember the other dude Kerry Jacobs and Kerry O'Quinn decided like, yeah, no, there should be a magazine, and we're going to name it Starlog after Captain Kirk. Starlog, Stardate, blah, 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 blah. And yeah, they had been the sort of standard bearer for a very long time for this audience.
And you moved on to Entertainment Weekly. Speaking of magazines, I have another copy here that I bought, which I enjoy very much. I want to show this one to you. You wrote the cover story.
I did.
Yeah.
I did. Yeah. I was lucky in that I came to EW in like 1996 as their comic book nerd. But they were a collection. They were a storehouse of nerds, but every kind of nerd. There was a soap opera nerd and a Harlequin romance nerd and a death metal nerd and a musical theater nerd. And I was the traditional comic book nerd. And I got there in 96 and fell in with the movie department. And then Spider-Man comes out, and, the X-Men come out, and the Matrix comes out. And suddenly we're ushered into this golden age of the geek, where it became mass entertainment again. It turned into like 1978 all over again, where everybody was talking about Star Wars. Now it was everybody was talking about a dozen things that were just as big and just as huge. And working at EW is how I started going to Comic-Cons for the first time, San Diego and New York, and that's how I ended up kind of segueing or adding to my moonlighting list of things to do, writing comic books in addition to being a journalist.
And this issue that I'm holding in particular, this is a February 2019 issue. This was right after Black Panther was nominated for 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, the first time, and so far the only time, that a comic book film was nominated for Best Picture at the Academy Awards. And you wrote a great article, and I wanted to read a passage of that article, and I'd just like you to talk about it and just talk about what this movie meant to you when you first saw it and what it means to you now. But you wrote, the power of Black Panther is that it imagines a place that could be home to millions who don't have one, a place that isn't marked by pain, but instead by progress, a land that knows its history and revels in it, rather than be embarrassed by it. Black Panther speaks to children who might still believe in fairy tales and gives them a new one with kings and queens, magic and honor, palaces and passion, and it speaks to their elders who might have forgotten how to believe in fairy tales. Well, what does Black Panther mean to you now, and what did it mean to you back then, this phenomenon of a movie that came out in 2018?
My feelings about Black Panther evolved over time. Like I remember the character from the comics, but I was not a deep reader of Black Panther. I remember when, the movie started production, when Marvel said, oh, hey man, we're doing Black Panthers in Civil War. Like we're doing it. We're actually going to do it. It's not that I was skeptical. I just wasn't invested, but the further we got into that story, the longer the narrative became, the ways that Hollywood remains surprised by things that seem obvious, always kind of rankles me just a little bit. They're always surprised when, a Black movie performs. They're always surprised. Like, how could this possibly happen? And when I first saw the movie, I appreciated it, but didn't quite love it. I think it's an imperfect film that has so much to recommend in it. But I always felt that, like, T'Challa he's not an active character. T'Challa's very passive. All T'Challa wants to do is maintain the status quo. And that is an odd choice for the protagonist of your story. All he wants to do is, I just want it to be the way it was. Just let's not monkey with things. It's tradition. This is how it's always been. This is the way my father did it. This is the way I want to do it. Until he learns a thing and discovers that maybe not everything was rosy behind the palace gates, and decides to make a change. But he's somewhat inert as a character. But everybody around him was really interesting. So I was very lucky in that I got to go to the movie premiere, which, if you've ever been to a movie premiere, you will never be in a more warm audience for a movie. Like, everybody who's in that house made the movie, loves the movie. It was, it was like Black Hollywood prom night, where, like, everybody in Black Hollywood shows up and shows out, and it's like everybody's got their church hats on and their finest, and it was a beautiful thing to be a part of. But it wasn't until I saw the movie with my son that I started to, like, really feel something about it, because, again, it was the idea that I have grown up and inured myself to the weirdness of being African American and not understanding, not having an easy way to grasp the history of a people. Like, too many of us have names that are not our own. Too many of us cannot, go to Ancestry and drop our DNA in there and get an answer that makes sense. But this is a movie that posits that, no, there was a home for you, even if you never knew there was. And it might be a place you can visit in your imagination. And so the idea that my son would grow up with this place, even if it's fictional, a thing that he could put a point of finger at, that he could put a name to. Wakanda was something aspirational that people of my generation never really had at that scale. And so that really, really shifted things for me. It really moved me deeply. And so I wrote about that quite a bit. I podcasted about that quite a bit. And when EW asked me, as an alum, to come back and write about that film, that's sort of what it became about for me, which is the celebration of this thing that by all rights shouldn't exist, but does, and does so beautifully and wrought with such care and talent and energy, and that we probably wouldn't see again. Unless it was a Black Panther sequel. But, you'd think that after a movie makes almost $2 billion, Hollywood would be rushing to make more things just like it. There are no other Black superhero movies. You'd think there'd be. There are none. So it's a very conflicting sense of pride that I have about that film. As a moviegoer, as a filmmaker, as a nerd, it is a lot of things all at once.
We want to take the last few minutes to talk about Adora and the Distance, a fantasy graphic novel released in 2022. Who or what inspired you to write this story?
It's very much inspired by my experience raising a child on the autism spectrum. My daughter, who is now, she'll be 21 this year, was diagnosed when she was about 2.5, 3 years old as being on the spectrum. And it's been an ongoing process of sort of education and learning and tolerance and empathy and all of the things that you already ordinarily have as a parent, but now you're adding a whole nother level of complexity to it. But I didn't want to write a story about raising a kid on the spectrum, because I am the least interesting person in this collection of characters. I have no mystery about me, but I don't know what she thinks about any given day. I'd like to think I know when she's happy or sad, but I don't know what's going on in her head. And so this is a book in which I imagine what is going on in her head, and it's a fantasy land full of knights and quests and lava monsters and underwater pirates and all of these things, because it seems, it's a fabulous thing, and it was very much inspired by the things she liked to watch. She likes to watch Finding Nemo. She liked to watch The Wiggles. She liked to watch The Backyardigans. R.I.P. Janice Burgess, who just passed away.
Yeah.
I think all of those things just kind of fed into the stuff she loved, and that consequently I was bombarded with because she loved it. And then doing what fiction gets to do, which is kind of synthesize and transform into its own story, its own narrative about, a girl trapped in a world that's wonderful, being pulled into a world that is not her own. And does she regret that? Does she resent that? Or does she embrace that?
Yeah. Well, I want to show you, we also have a copy of that book as well. And, I just want to thank you for writing this book, because we also have a family member who is on the autism spectrum. My youngest son, Keith's little brother.
May or may not hear him in the background.
Yeah. So, I find it hard to find books that represent him and other kids on the spectrum. When I picked this up and I read it, it was just wonderful. And what I also liked is, you did the afterwards, and you talked about how much your daughter loves the Wiggles. We play the Wiggles almost every day here. We grew up watching, Greg Murray and Jeff and Anthony. I thought it was so cool that you named 4 of the characters in the graphic novel after them. So it's just so much. It was so much fun to read, because it was just so similar to what we live and what we're going through. But wonderful book you wrote.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. I mean, it has been one of the really great pleasures of my career to, like, the thing you hope for when you write a story, when you tell any story, is that somebody out there somewhere, a chord will be plucked in them, and they will understand it. They will see a little bit of themselves in it. They will respond to it. It is not, for me, about sales figures. It's not really about awards. It's not about any of that stuff. It's, did somebody else find a piece of themselves in the work? Did somebody else like it? And I've had such lovely interactions with people, especially around this book, just talking about how, it's not my life, but I see it in there. It's not exactly what my experience is, but I'm familiar with it. And I have got a brother, sister, cousin, whatever it is on the spectrum, and don't encounter that version of that tale out there in the world. And I, as anybody with a kid on the spectrum in their lives know, they're all like snowflakes. There's no one like another. They're all different in their own special, wonderful ways. So it's can the experience feel universal while also being specific? And I remain so proud of that work, because it seems to, people respond to it in a way that's always just incredibly nurturing to me, for when the writing goes poorly, for when the reviews aren't great, for when that job didn't happen, for when whatever, fresh ding in the side of my soul the world wants to create. There's always like, hey, somebody liked the book. Somebody liked the thing I did once.
Yeah, and I wish there were more books like this. But I want to know, what were the challenges, if you had any challenges that you faced pitching this idea for a book? Because I'm not a publisher or an agent, but I'm thinking that talking about a child or an adult on the spectrum may not be an easy sell. Publishers might shy away from it because they think there isn't a market for this type of book. What challenges did you go through to get this written and published?
The biggest challenges were, I don't think, to your point, from a purely economic perspective, publishers realized the size of this audience. That I would always tell them. It's like, yeah, you know what? It's 1 out of every 110 kids, and those numbers would begin to change over time. When I started pitching, it was 1 in 130. Then it was like 1 in 100, and now it's like 1 in 95 or whatever it is. Children are diagnosed on the spectrum every year, and so that is an enormous amount of the population who has autism in their lives in one way or another. Not to be completely crass and mercantile, but those are people who might buy a book. So there's an audience out there, and I don't think people quite got that in the beginning of that journey. And they didn't like, some potential audiences didn't like that it felt like a Twilight Zone episode. They didn't like that there was a twist at the end. They're like, it felt like it's coming out of nowhere. Can we just make that more of the story? Can we make the real world more of her experience? And I'm like, but it isn't. That's not how the story kind of works. It doesn't work where we spend too much time with her parents, and the story's not about her parents. So I kept pushing back on that and kept, occasionally would say, I don't want to turn it into that and walk away from a potential publishing partner. But eventually, the hope is always, if the work is good, somebody will see it, and somebody will recognize it. And that's exactly what happened when I pitched Comixology Originals and, to do the original digital release, and then Dark Horse, who picked it up for print. I think they understood, like they saw it, and they got that it was a story of passion and a story of very deep personal meaning to me. And they're like, well, that's the kind of people we want to do. That's the kind of stories we want to tell, the stories that mean something to the people who write them. And so it was a long road with lots of starts and stops. But I think ultimately it ended up at exactly the right place at exactly the right time.
Mr. Mark, thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. Where can people find you?
I'm on the internet, not as much as I used to be, because Twitter is, or whatever they're calling it now, is not a welcoming environment anymore. But you can find me on Instagram at Marc Bernardin. You can find me on Blue Sky at Marc Bernardin. You can find me on Threads at Marc Bernardin. My Facebook, it's Marc Bernardin Official. If you want to just show up and be a fan. My personal account is just so that my parents can see pictures of the grandkids. I am not looking for brand new faces on there. But I'm out in the world. We do a podcast every week, Kevin and I. We Zoom more often than not, but every now and again we might be in a city near you, or if you're in Los Angeles at the Scum and Villainy Cantina. But yeah, that is where I am in the world.
Yeah. Well, you are incredibly talented, and we are so glad to have you on our podcast. And as you can see, I mean, we have a lot of your work, and I do listen to you whenever a new Fat Man Beyond drops. So I'm still looking forward to the next episode. That's going to be very interesting.
Yes, I get to talk to Kevin about Dune 2.
Yes.
Oh,
right.
you know what's funny?
Yeah.
Kevin Smith is in Lego Batman 3.
Oh, is he? Lego Batman 3. Okay.
Yeah, as a character.
Yeah, he's pretty popular. Yeah,
that dude is everywhere.
Thank you. Keith, where can people find us?
You can find us wherever you get your podcast, socials, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Fathers of Galaxy, website fathersofgalaxy.com. You can check out our merch store, fathersofgalaxy.myexpressshop.com, and donate to our Patreon page. Please, I need to buy the Skywalker Saga DLCs. My soul will be incomplete without them at patreon.com/fathersofgalaxy.
All right. Thank you.
Once again, please give me that money.
Okay. All right. So, Mark, so issue number 2.
Yes.
Mace Windu drops soon, right? Next week? Or is it
I think it's the second week of March. So yeah, next week.
Okay. And how many issues? Do you know how many issues in total will it be?
4 total.
4. Okay.
4 total. So when they collect the trade, it will have all 4 of those issues plus the tiny story from the Star Wars Revelations kind of anthology that teed up. It's the front half of the adventure that we begin issue 1 with.
Got it. Okay. All right. Well, thank you once again. Marc Bernardin, writer, producer, director, all around good guy and extremely talented. So thank you so much once again, Mark, for joining us on our podcast.
Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. And it's been kind of wonderful. It's a bit like I'm looking through the prisms of a time crystal where I see both myself at my current age and then myself when I was like 11. Huh. So it's like, it's all of me on the other end of the podcast.
The Chrono Bowl of Time.
Yeah. It's pretty cool. This is pretty cool to be in this space, to meet people like you. So thanks again.
It's beautiful, man. Keep going.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
That is it for this episode, everyone. So thank you for joining, watching, or listening to us. Until next time, take care. And we will see you again.